Hey, Pretty Girl Club. So I wanted to make this video about the trend online about being 90s fine. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but a lot of people are talking about how they want to be 90s fine. I've noticed a lot of black women, they're talking about how they want to be 90s fine, and they're also calling men 90s fine. So I do have a new series that will be coming out about this other guy that I just heard of on the day of the Super Bowl. His name is Jalen. I think it's Jalen Hurts or Jalen Hutz. It's one of those names. So I heard about him on the day of the Super Bowl. And when I looked him up to potentially add him as a person that I'm going to do a series on, I noticed a lot of black women were saying he's quote unquote 90s fine. And then I started getting more posts on my algorithm about like 90s fine. And I noticed that women were also talking about Genuine, the singer. So then I started to notice a pattern. I was like, wait a minute. I thought the 90s and 2000s is when you guys were talking about how you suffered from colorism, texturism, and featureism. If you look at the trends on YouTube throughout the 2000s and 2010s, a lot of black female content creators were literally trauma dumping about all of the bad things that happened to them during the 99s and the 2000s. So I thought that that era was an era where only the black women who benefited from colorism, texturism, or featureism were considered fine, according to your own talking points. And this is proof that a lot of black women don't actually care about colorism, texturism, and featureism because they will either perpetuate it by pedestalizing men that benefit from colorism, texturism, or featureism, or they themselves will go behind closed doors and try to look like a 90s beauty icon when we know that overwhelmingly the beauty icons of the 90s and 2000s in black media were definitely black women that benefited from isms. I'm not saying that there were no unambiguous dark-skinned black women with their natural hair who, had a pedestal back then, but generally speaking, we all know who the main beauty icons were of that time. One of the main talking points of colorism YouTube channels was about how the love interests in black movies were always lighter than the man. So the woman was always lighter than the man. This is where they got that talking point of love is based on colorism or black love is based on colorism. That's where they got that talking point from. They got it from black media. They got it from the subliminal messages that they felt they received by watching black movies. And I mean, I have to agree, a lot of the movies, they really did show a darker man with a lighter woman. Doesn't matter if the characters were both dark-skinned or light-skinned, the woman was usually lighter than the man. Okay, so then why would you want to now bring back being quote-unquote 90s fine? And for those of you who try to argue and say, oh, being 90s fine is just about makeup and clothes. It's not about like the overall aesthetic. Okay, so then why do they call it 90s fine? Why don't they call it 90s makeup or 90s hairstyles? Why don't they call it that? Why do they specifically call it 90s fine and make it co-ed? Well, it's because it's literally based on the beauty standards and pedestalization of men and women in the 90s. And the majority of that was based on colorism, texturism, and featureism. Another interesting thing, too, is that the 90s, if you look at a lot of the media and a lot of the culture in the 90s, it was very black male-centered. It was very centered around the black male gaze. And if you look at a lot of women in Generation X, a lot of Generation X women are also very male-centered in general, but also black male-centered if they grew up in black culture. So I thought that we were divesting. I thought a lot of you guys were feminists. So why are you now behind closed doors when you think that MLS women are not looking? You're behind closed doors talking about you want to be 90s fine and you want a man that's 90s fine. But then you come online and you try to perform in front of us and you try to convince us that our beauty is mediocre and we're not that pretty. You say that women like Lori Harvey are quote unquote just regular and not really even light skinned and you don't even count as mixed. So you're going out of your way to try to make these women who have the quote unquote 90s fine aesthetic, you're going out of your way in public to try to convince us over here that we're just all regular. But then behind closed doors, you want to have the same look. And by the way, remember how people used to say that in the 90s their makeup looked casket ready? Okay, so I thought their makeup was bad. So why would you even want to emulate that makeup? Why would you want your makeup to look quote unquote casket ready? Why would you want to put on a lighter color of foundation, a lighter color of concealer? That's casket ready makeup, right? That's not pretty. It's not pretty to have a skin tone that looks slightly lighter, right? Which one is it? Like, do you see the constant moving of the goalpost? Do you see how whenever they think the public is watching, they will say things like, oh no, we're the blueprint. it's all about unambiguous black beauty and, wearing your natural hair, whatever, letting your natural features show. But then behind closed doors, they literally want to go right back to the exact same traumas that they claim they had. They claim they had so many traumas from the 99s and the 2000s. Meanwhile, they want to look like the women of the 99s and the 2000s. And for the people who say that, oh no, being 90s fine, it's just about having natural skincare and like natural hair. Okay, well, a lot of the women in the 90s did not wear their hair natural. They had relaxers. The same relaxers that you tried to make fun of women in the exotical space because you thought they had relaxers or you're claiming they had relaxers. You're making fun of people in this space because you think they have relaxers or they have blonde highlights or whatever. But then behind closed doors, as a collective, we see a lot of unambiguous black women talking about how they actually admire that aesthetic and think that aesthetic is beautiful. The quote unquote good hair that they complained about. The 90s and 2000s are notorious for people making comments about you have good hair or you have bad hair or your hair's nappy or you need a perm. So isn't it interesting how they used colorism, texturism, and featureism to get attention and social climb on social media? They use isms to try to gain views or, gain financial stability. You've got unambiguous black women profiting off of the insecurities of other unambiguous black women by telling them that nobody likes them, everybody hates them, you're the most denigrated in society, you're at the bottom of society, you're beneath everybody, even black men, you're beneath the black man, so you're literally the scum of the earth. So you got unambiguous content creators making money by telling dark-skinned black women how much it sucks to be a dark-skinned black woman. And a lot of that trauma that even gave those women that mindset came from the 90s. It came from the 90s. If you look at some of the most popular colorism content creators on YouTube, a lot of them were born in the 80s or 90s, or they grew up maybe in the 90s and in the early 2000s. Another thing that they're leaving out about this whole 90s fine trend, in the 90s and 2000s, being skinny was definitely the standard. Having a flat stomach, having a flat chest, flat booty, or maybe in some cases they had like boob jobs and stuff. But generally speaking, being skinny, size 6 and below on average, was the beauty standard in the 90s. But then you've got performative women on TikTok today saying that, oh, well, a grown woman should have grown women wait on her, and you guys look like children, and you have no ass, you drink nasty Slim Quick shakes. But then if you look at their cultural trends on social media, they're literally wanting to look like that secretly. So this is a part of the everlasting exotical pedestal that I talk about. We will always be on a pedestal no matter what. Not only are we the standard of beauty, we are the standard of dating, we are the standard of living, and now we are also even the standard of nostalgia and nostalgic beauty. Because, like I said, the overwhelming majority of beauty icons, whether it's male or female, of the 90s and Y2K, were generally black people that benefited from either colorism, texturism, featureism, or mixed race privilege. And the majority of those women were literally skinny, and they were at a healthy weight. But then people want to come into the exotical space and say that we are anorexic. And again, with the people who try to say like, oh, the 90s fine, that's just about being naturally pretty. Okay, well, the 90s and 2000s is one of the time periods where you saw the least amount of afros, for sure. That's where you saw the least amount of 4C hair and shrunken type 4 hair. So much so to the point where they actually had to create a natural hair movement, and it had to gain popularity online in the 2010s. Because that is how rare it was to even see natural type 4 hair just out in a wash and go. That was not a thing in the 90s and 2000s. Oh, I'm just going to wear a wash and go. No, the wash and goes were for the quote unquote good hair people. I'm saying that was the trend. The trend was literally texturism in the 90s and 2000s. So isn't it ironic that the same community that tries to use isms to shame other people or to try to force men into dating them, the same group is now behind closed doors saying they want to be quote unquote 90s fine. And they're saying they want a man who's 90s fine. Even though they tell us exoticals, oh, your pedestal only exists in the black community. Okay, well, all these men you're calling 90s fine are in the black community. They're either mixed black men or they're fully black men. So saying that the exoticals don't have a pedestal or like whatever men the Exoticals attract are automatically going to be dusty due to their blackness. Not only is that internalized racism right there, because you're equating blackness to dustiness. Okay, so what does that make your family lineage? What does that make your fathers and grandfathers? What does that make you a descendant of if blackness and black culture means dusty? Okay, so that's already one talking point destroyed right there. But then number two, behind closed doors, they're still attracted to these same men that they try to shame MLS women for dating. And this is another thing. Not only are these women extremely male-centered because they literally bring men into everything, I have really tried my hardest on this channel. I've created hundreds of videos that have nothing to do with men, but I've noticed a lot of unambiguous women online. They somehow always find a way to bring men back into the conversation. But isn't it ironic how the same ones they're lusting after online, such as Aaron Pierre and Jalen Hurts, and they're calling these guys 90s fine, and they're saying Genuine when he was younger, he's quote-unquote 90s fine. Okay, so these same men, Chris Brown, if you think of the guys from the 90s and 2000s, a lot of MLS men in the Hollywood were pedestalized as well. So these women are literally, they're still lusting after our counterparts. So they're trying to convince us women that we are mediocre or we're not that cute or we're just regular. You know, we look like everybody. They even said that Beyonce looks like every woman in Houston. So every person in Houston looks like Beyonce, apparently. So they're trying to convince us that we're somehow regular and mediocre, but behind closed doors, they want to be quote-unquote 90s fine. So they want to look like Tia and Tamara. They want to look like Aaliyah. They want to look like Beyonce. They want to look like all these other women that they complained about, saying that those women only got to where they are due to colorism, texturism, and featureism. They continue this bad social climbing tactic of making women that they hate famous. You see that happening currently with Ice Spice. So, you know, Ice Spice is another woman that they hate, but they made her famous. That's a bad social climbing move. That's a horrible social climbing move. So they're constantly putting their own image last. Constantly putting their own women last. They're ignoring Ari Lennox. Ari Lennox was crashing out online because she was not getting support from her black female audience. So they're ignoring women like Ari Lennox in favor of women like Ice Spice, and then they turn around and say, well, Ice Spice, you only got to where you are because of colorism. So then who are the colorists then? Who are the colorists who listen to Ice Spice's music? Who are all those colorists who follow Ice Spice on Instagram? Who are all those colorists that keep up with Ice Spice's personal life and who she's dating, who she's talking to, what kind of friend she is? Who are all those colorists that got her to where she is? And for those of you who try to argue and say that, like, oh, being 90s fine, it had nothing to do with colorism, texturism, and featureism. Yes, it did. Because historically, the 90s and 2000s were extremely colorist. Colorism was not a mainstream conversation back then. So yes, people were definitely benefiting from colorism. Also, I have been called 90s fine myself in real life, like recently. And I am a person who definitely benefits from isms. So why is it that the overwhelming majority of the people they're calling 90s fine are not dark-skinned, unambiguous black people with shrunken 4C hair and broad features? Why aren't they calling that phenotype 90s fine? Are overweight, unambiguous black women the definition that they're talking about when they say 90s fine? I don't think so. But what do you ladies think? Let me know in the comment section, and I'll talk to you next time. Stay pretty, ladies.